Hello, and welcome to another episode of Radio Miles, the podcast all about Flann O'Brien, Miles Nagopaline, George Noel, and the many other pseudonyms and personae of the writer Brian O'Nolan. This podcast, poised between the pub and the peer review, is made with the support of Birkbeck College, University of London. And my guest today is Joseph LaBine. Joe is a poet and critic specializing in modern Celtic literatures and also a senior advisor in the Canadian Civil Service. He received his doctorate from the University of Ottawa in 2023, where he held a Mary Tremaine Fellowship from the Bibliographical Society of Canada and a doctoral fellowship from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. He has been the managing editor of Flat Singles Press since 2013 and lives in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. So Joe is here with me today to talk about our new special edition of the Parish Review dedicated to Flann O'Brien and the radio. He has published very widely on topics ranging from Flann O'Brien, his milieu, Irish modernism, Joyce, philosophy, and several articles and chapters produced in collaboration with me. But today we are discussing what I feel is no less than the namesake of this very podcast and kind of an idea we've been working on since the podcast's inception, which is Miles on the Radio or Radio Miles. We're discussing a special edition of the Parish Review that started live as an online workshop held on 1st of April 2023 and has culminated in the special edition published just at the end of 2025. So welcome to the podcast, Joe. At long last, you are on my podcast.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's early here, but I'm glad to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Is there anything you wanted to add or amend about my introduction?
No, that was very generous, nearly too generous.
You recently brought out the first volume of a collection of Montgomery's poetry, Terminal Volume 1, and we would advise any listeners to the podcast to get a hold of that volume for sure. It's a really fantastic, groundbreaking piece of publication work, I think.
I appreciate that. I'll say that our work on radio, which for me started in 2019, we had a conference in Dublin. I was on a panel with an essay that was published on radio jamming that I'm sure you'll mention. This work began for me in 2019, and we've carried on for the last 5 years building this up and working towards something. It's very nice to see the issue out with the Neil Montgomery book. And yeah, you're dead right. We've got the first volume of his poems out. It's Terminal 1. It was published by Flat Singles Press, and the second volume will hopefully be out at the end of this year. That was similarly a work of years. In 2016, I approached Neil Montgomery's estate and said, can we publish this collected version of his poems that he prepared before his death? It took 10 years to get the first volume out. So I understand that these are always projects that take longer than intended and are labors of many years. So grateful to be here. Happy to be talking about this.
I thought the best way to structure this episode would be to talk through each of the 4 articles of the special edition in turn, and potentially also talk briefly about the review by A&M in the edition as well. I just want to begin by turning to our leading article in the edition. In doing so, we're able to give a bit of background as to why radio and Brian O'Nolan, Flann O'Brien is so important. Could you just spend a few minutes telling our listeners about the article we collaborated on, which reads O'Nolan's work in the context of contemporary theories of radio and argues that radio transmission was a live event in Ireland up to the 1930s and is critical to understanding his work overall, right?
Sure. Thanks for this. This is an easy one because we wrote it and we've now read it several times. I think that our main intention with this, rather than just write an introduction introducing the articles, and here I have to go back a little bit to 2023 and 2022, I had submitted an article to the parish called Information Please, which was an archival excavation of some of the work that O'Nolan had done for radio, and then some of his writing about radio. I write a little bit about the short story Kill, which was in Irish, but is really a kind of fictional exploration of the effect of radio listening and the effect of experiencing radio as a kind of live product. And so I had put this essay out, which is the bits and pieces I was able to cobble together archivally of what O'Nualláin's participation in radio might have been, and the activities of friends like Sheridan and Neil Montgomery and Donna McDonough and other people in his sort of wider UCD circle who were all active in radio at the time. And what we drew from that when we talked about it was that this is significant because everyone in his circle seems to have been involved with producing writing, to be read for radio, and obviously there's a monetary component for that, or in the very least, like participating in radio as broadcasters and presenters. We know that Niall Sheridan went on to have a long career with RT, but I think more than anything, we became interested in how that could happen, certainly the historical biographical interest of what exactly happened and what that meant broadly for Irish radio, like what was happening at the time. So that was one of our central questions. And our piece, that we've done, rather than just be an introduction to the articles in this issue, which are all great, by the way, and I hope we spend more time on theirs than ours, rather than just introduce them, what I wanted to do at least was speak to the live context of what was happening on radio. And there's some historical points to cover here. I think that radio was established in Ireland in 1926, and it really is coming to Ireland later than it is to other nations. When we look at Radio Paris and Radio Germany, there's a lot of work done on Radio Paris. Here I'm talking, about Derek Valiant's studies on Radio Paris and kind of, the sort of using the American radio model, really valuable historical work. But, in terms of Irish radio, radio is coming late, and the studio is sort of bare bones. And so technologies that might have been more readily available at other locations, like in terms of broadcasting power, transmission power, production values, the BBC in nearby England, recording and inscription capability arrived by the mid-30s in Germany. These amenities of radio production and broadcasting were just not available in Ireland at the same time. So radio is coming late, and it's different. There's a kind of liveness, a need to encourage a different kind of presenting, more what Benjamin calls democracy at the microphone, that democratizing effect is readily apparent in the Irish example. And so this obviously interested us, and we wanted to return O'Nualláin's writing for radio, his writing about radio, his participation in radio, to this live context. And we really set a hard task for ourselves. The reason I think it's a hard task is because there's no kind of sound archive to refer to. We have to go with the print record, which is at different points inadequate. And we also have to admit our own limitations, that we're not historians of the technology itself. We're really just interested in this idea of how are all these writers that we're interested in writing for and about radio. And what does radio as a kind of context, a kind of modality or a sort of technological feature of their lives, the same way, internet would be for writers of our generation, how does this inform the work they're doing? That was the question driving us. And our piece tries to theorize what radio could mean and return some of the writing to that context. Liveness is what we've been driving at.
Yeah, and I want to move on to the other articles in a special edition of the Parish Review rather than just dwell on our own article. Just to kind of tee this up, I would say that the article does synthesize research we've done over the past few years, which pulls together some really interesting statistics about the spread of radio to help distinguish the Irish experience of radio from that in the United States, that in Germany, that in France and Italy, as well as at the same time drawing upon the radio theorization happening in all of those countries as well. My favorite context to bring in is the lesser known but important writing of Theodore Adorno. He's writing about American radio in English in the early 1940s. I would point out, again, as a bit of a advert, why should you read this article? You surfaced a magazine whose title in English is the New Irish Magazine, which demonstrates the same kind of theorizing about radio that's happening in amongst, the fascist movement, the futurist movement, among people working for the BBC, you name it. This is also happening in a small scale in Irish periodicals. And so we do have references to the radio mind, the emerging radio mind that is in Ireland, and radio as a modern Tower of Babel. I believe that this is a completely new source to radio scholarship, right?
I can't take full credit for this, Toby. I really have to say that it's Ian O'Queeve who found those magazines in the archive and just said, hey, you should look at this. I had the privilege of getting a whack of photos of those radio editorials and being able to loop that in. I guess as an introductory remark to the rest of the issue and what we sort of see this project is generally, for scholars who are kind of coming to this podcast and our work was sort of asking that question of what is this? In some respects, it's a project of social history. One theorist has said, and this is David Hendy, that you can't begin to work on radio without considering it within a kind of cultural studies context. It's always going to return you to the written record. Why? Because you have to go back to newspapers to see what was actually on at the time because it's a live context. And I've always found that very interesting. There's a lot of social history here. I'm thinking of Catriona Clear and other Irish writers who, I admire who've done this kind of, what's happening in the Irish home, what's happening in Ireland at the time. Similarly, maybe this is a good segue into Elliot's piece because Elliot has done such great work on the civil service and civil service writers. We can't think of radio in Ireland without thinking of its relationship to post and telegraphs, to an actual government department, to having civil servants like O'Nualláin himself participating in and writing for radio as a kind of government entity, controlling through the exchequer, the actual funding, through advertising revenues and things like this. So that's all very interesting as well, this sort of relationship between radio as a state broadcaster to the people of Ireland and also to the government itself. I definitely think every article in this issue is a standout article that is doing something new that hasn't been done before, and maybe we're the exception to this in the respect that we just have this job of pointing to what everyone else is doing and being like, aren't they doing a great job? Like, isn't this interesting? But Paul Fagan talks brilliantly about Larry Morrow, someone coming from the BBC, down to Dublin to sort of bring his production expertise and his brilliance as an adapter of literary works for radio production. Paul has excavated some interesting stuff that I hope we'll talk about. Zan Kamek talking about the gramophone and the idea of playback and how this plays in theoretically to what's happening at the time. There's a lot of rich stuff here, so I don't want to get stuck on us either. I think the project we're engaged in is a kind of social history. There's been a lot of work done in this vein. We're not the only ones. Deborah Ray Cohen's piece picks up this theorizing. We're writing about a moment in the 1930s and 1940s where many people were theorizing about radio, what it could be, what it could do, what it meant for people's lives. This continued into the 60s by a Canadian writer like Marshall McLuhan. Deborah Ray Cohen, a historian of radio and sound study, has said in a few different ways that we're almost doing a disservice to just think about radio in and of itself, the way that we would think of the internet in and of itself. Really, when we think of sound studies and this particular context and this particular period, we have to refer to it or think of it more as an ecology, as a kind of series of relationships that are interconnected. And so this is something that really puts into play Zan's pieces about the gramophone, but that is part of this wider sort of ecology within this historical moment that we're talking about. I really think that's an interesting way to think about this because up to this point, I had only ever thought of Nolan's writing, yes, he produced these scripts for radio. Yes, he produced these scripts for television. But I've been dissuaded from that sort of style of thinking and, now thinking about the technology more in terms of this kind of contextual frame of a sort of ecology, of the interconnected relationships. And yeah, I just want to end there, that would be, the introduction for this, that we're trying to push this idea that there is this sort of better relationships worth exploring. I think these articles do that in a wonderful way.
They do indeed. And I think we could probably add to that, instead of thinking about Flann O'Brien writing, as you said, for radio or appearing on radio, we might use that philosophical concept from the non-human studies space, which is he is writing with radio. Radio is always connected. And I think if we turn to the first article after our one, Zan Kamek's, where she's really bridging the theoretical and research gap that exists, quite a long-term interest in the gramophone and Bell Bocht, those recording technologies, with radio studies proper through the means of looking at almost a theorization, a very practical theorization of sonic materiality in O'Nualláin's work overall. I think she does a really good job of demonstrating how O'Nualláin he's kind of conscious of the firstly, I think, has a very high level of theoretical understanding of what recording and broadcasting sounds means, and is very interested in the movement of information, different media. I think it's coming to radio with a very sophisticated theoretical understanding. This leads to many jokes. She points out in a Chris Lawn article, Miles suggests that one might try to speed read a record by scanning the grooves of the naked eye. And there's various different jokes and ideas about the use of recordings, the use of broadcasting, the use of movement of sound in his work. Zan's article is a fantastic theoretical bridge that connects the broader area of material culture studies to sound studies, and hence gives us a basis to understand the significance of radio in his work.
I would agree. This is a fascinating question that has always I ask myself, where does he get this stuff? I think some of the examples that Zan draws, certainly from Bell Box, and the idea of these sorts of devices, the gramophone, recording, speech in that book, where did he get these ideas? I think the short answer from the social history side of things is because these were not necessarily commonplace, but certainly happening at the time. And somebody with a kind of encyclopedic mind and a curious interest and a frequent avid reader of newspapers, which we knew he was, is picking up on these things and gleaning them. And so it's interesting to see that threaded back in within the sort of theory of the time. So yes, I agree. And it really is a fascinating thread to see this interest in the gramophone, inscription and recording for playback. To see these things played out in a long form is fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the right way to approach this Zan's article and its significance is to really understand how it's a bit like the point we're making about how our article addresses this idea of writing with radio, writing kind of around it, for it, influenced by it, is there is a slippage between what is material, what is immaterial, the basis of understanding sound as material as we have to understand sound as a kind of transitionary moment of transmission of energy between two material surfaces, and in between this, it has its own significance. We want to put something like sound, a gramophone, radio, into a kind of different stream from writing that's happening at the time or from these other media. We talked today about channels, marketing channels, different spaces, but everyone who understands marketing channels understands that really all the channels interpenetrate and overlap. And I think the way that Zan's article approaches this is helping us to, as she puts it, the way that sound, once mediated, can collapse distinctions between things like signal and noise, between agent and machine. And it's a kind of messy overlap that O'Nualláin takes as his starting point. I think that would have been influenced by a very early interest in mechanical devices, technologies, cinematographic technologies, sound technologies, that kind of runs right through his writing and his work. The necessity of decoding something that is material is not like an unmediated transmission of information. It's an object that's manipulable by other objects.
I think this is the interesting dialectical distinction of Zan's piece within the context of the issue and the wider work we're doing. As historians, literary scholars, we're interested in the material trace. We go to the archive, look for documents, look at texts, and study them. There is always this kind of material culture we're dealing with, this technological culture that we see, that Zan writes really elegantly about the gramophone, the need to sort of wind it, the playback, cranking, the tension within the springs. But then what happens is also sort of an immaterial event. We point at this in terms of liveness, but Zan kind of gets at the heart of this idea that there's this tension in that relationship between the material and the immaterial. And I think this is something that Nualláin exploits in really interesting fictive ways. We see this across the novels. This is something that happens in At Swim Two Birds and The Third Policeman. As others have said, like we see, fairies projecting their voice from a pocket or, people speaking, in an almost ethereal, ghostly way from the other side of the room, or what have you, that these are sort of elements of transmission. These are elements like ideas like amplification and ideas that relate to the technology of the time in a material way, but nevertheless are material events. And I think that tension, which many people in sound studies have spent a lot of time working out and seeing, what is this? And do we go through a sort of immaterial philosophy, or do we think of this purely in terms of the technological constraint? I just think that it's another interesting gloss here, that if you're coming from sound studies and you're curious about the Irish example of radio and the actual technological ability of the studio, or even like in a granular sense, this sort of material conditions of gramophone, like this is an issue for you. It really does touch on those things.
Yeah, that was really fascinating to dive into those in-depth material factors. And as in so many different cases, Ireland provides a very unusual edge case that enables us a better understanding, as we've been mentioning, particularly this genuinely live moment, which I do remember defending in the process of peer review of our article. This is definitely a moment in which there is a media which is live, which is ephemeral, or which is produced live and generally not recorded. That seems like both, as you said, it's a research, problem, but it's also a very, very interesting theoretical space to work in. We're going to move on to Elliot Mills's fantastic essay in this special issue of the Parish Review. This is really a piece of work about the evolving relationship, you could say, that Brian and the writer has with radio and also with TV broadcasting too, as Elliot describes him as a cross-media writer. Effectively, Mills paints a picture of a quite complex relationship where, as Miles Nagopaline, he is writing in quite a critical way about development of radio as a popular medium. There's a really interesting analysis of atmospherics in the later novel The Dalkey Archive, 1964, in relation to media theory at the time, showing this acute awareness of the critical aspects of media theory that are developing on Nolan's part. And at the same time, as a writer, he's pitching work to the radio. He is trying to get programs made. He is getting programs made on television later in life too. But he's sometimes doing so in a subversive way, proposing quiz programs which would humiliate the audience, in a way that pretty much anticipates the development of reality TV later, but would have been a bit too out there for the time. So it's this really complex relationship with radio as an emerging and more powerful mass media on the part of a Nolan. I think the article does a really good job of showing how you have to, as the title puts it, play the game. You're in a media world at the same time as you're critiquing it. It's just not as straightforward as sitting in a parody and attacking. We're inside this world of technology that we might be critiquing. I just think this is a really interesting essay, an article which addresses that almost life lived along with the radio and developing his attitude towards it as we go.
I think that the radio quiz as a central feature of this piece is fascinating, sort of totem, I guess, for this area of study, because my first piece on radio, as you know, was focused on the quiz show Information Please, and, later Question Time, which is a later version of that radio quiz. And so to see these proposals that Elliot digs up about, parody of that radio quiz show and his columns about the radio quiz. One of the things that Martin Green says in his introduction to Miles Away from Dublin, when he's talking about Bones of Contention, this column for the Carlow newspapers, is George Noel. One of the things he says as a key difference between Miles and George Noel is that George Noel will never get you lost in the radio quiz the way Miles does. I think this is actually the key feature, the way that it winds up his readers in a sort of language game, which we know is something that Miles loves and delights in, and Nolan like really, the kind of pedantry of these sort of linguistic games. The difference with George Noel maybe is that he just sort of explains the etymology of the word and goes through it, and we get this long, polite article about what words mean for Carlow readers. But in Dublin, People are getting roped in and sent up, much to our delight. And so I think that that's a wonderful feature of this article, just showing the importance of that as a feature of the column and as something that is really part of his wider project. Great essay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is important to, as it always felt important to my understanding of Flann O'Brien, but as Eliot's conclusion suggests, it helps us understand and navigate this emerging understanding of modernists overall. They participate in cultural production, they need to earn money, they need to market themselves, but they also need to maintain autonomy in some way. Both of those things have to happen in the history of modernism, and this comes across clearly if you look at people like Deborah Ray Cohen's work and that whole radio studies as it emerged. We've actually started out looking at almost like the most modernist radio, right? Like the most avant-garde, niche kind of productions in order to try to preserve this now thoroughly demolished myth of some kind of separation, some kind of full autonomy of modernism from the kind of arenas of modernity, such as radio. And I think Eliot's article is a really good way to help see that. It's something to touch on before we move on. I hope this is relevant to the transition to the next article. He is using the radio to craft a public persona around Miles Nagoplin, previously, his other personae. At the same time as he's rising inside the civil service, radio is itself a department of the civil service, which is unusual compared to other radios of the other radio infrastructure of Britain, France, Germany, where it's an arm's length organization. And obviously, there's numerous private organizations. That's not the case for RTE. In the early days, it's pretty much a government department. This is quite interesting, isn't it? Like, even down to the people involved, how they're involved. This is not a simple separation of the state with cultural production in Ireland. They're clearly very tightly bound together.
I think this really is the fascinating question, which is certainly an offline question for you and I. How is radio in Ireland different, and what is the extent of some of these things? When I think of the context, radio in the United States really is king by this point in time. By the time that radio is really becoming popular in Ireland and households are starting to get sets, it's really taking hold. Radio is still very important, Germany, Paris, but the United States really is a different case because they don't have the same kind of national competition that Ireland would have. People with wireless sets in Ireland, can get the BBC, certainly depending on what part of the country, but they can also get other nations transmitting, so later listeners, and this is in, of course, in the 1950s, will talk about Radio Luxembourg, more than they'll talk about of the time. And then, of course, one of the things that no one actually writes about is the incursion of Radio Paris into Ireland and what that can mean. I think that this question of government intervention in radio is a really fascinating one. It sets up this interesting dichotomy for people who study Flann O'Brien, because on the one hand, we know that Flann O'Brien is the civil servant of this point in time, Brian O'Nualláin, who works in the government and has a job, is aware of this department, knows the players, applies at different points for a job within that department, has friends like Sheridan and others who have key roles within broadcasting and radio production. But I think the other side that we have to kind of reflect on what interests him in radio, and I think it's the enormous potential of it. If the novel or fiction generally is a kind of dialogue, the radio amps that up in unique and powerful ways. When we're starting to talk about this incursion of French voices within an Irish language story, that becomes profound. And I think when we think about a novel, one of the things that Paul Fagan has written about so elegantly is the idea of the disembodied voice. The radio amps up that idea and takes it to a sort of new frontier. And so I think that while the government relationship with radio, the lack of funding, the lower production standards within Radio Ireland, which is certainly something that Larry Morrow influenced for the better, while the actual historical situation was poor and maybe confining from one sense when we think about O'Nualláin and his ability to work within radio in Ireland, I think the other sense is that we have to draw on here is that there's this enormous potential he sees and wants to take advantage of. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think that because the standards were low and radio was kind of an open entity, there was this ability to come in and broadcast from Athlone early on, and he certainly did that. I just see that all the writers in this issue, including ourselves, are noticing this moment when Irish writers are noticing radio for the first time. And that's not limited to O'Nualláin. Certainly, this is a long conversation that people have had about reading James Joyce, but also as we show writers like Michéal Ó Nualláin, writers like Neil Montgomery, people see this enormous kind of fictional potential of using radio to express something, exploring it as a kind of idea of what it does to fiction. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there, but that is operative for us.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Paul Fagan's work, which takes us to the final article in the special edition of the Parish Review, which is Paul Fagan's work on H.L. Morrow and Brian Nolan on Radio Iran. This article is really interesting because Paul works backwards from an understanding that Larry Morrow was involved in commissioning special broadcasts of Nolan's work for radio later. This whole piece started from this kind of forgotten in a revival, on the BBC that took place in 1960s, 1970s. He works backwards to actually do something really, really significant, which is establish that H.L. Morrow he's a fellow, Northerner from a nationalist family of important cultural figures. He is a kind of a colleague, a key kind of co-traveler for O'Nualláin, who has many related activities. Through looking into this radio connection, Paul excavates someone who really is a significant figure. The best thing about excavating these other figures who are collaborators, supporters, friends, so people who socialize with Nolan is their lives help to create a composite picture, which means that we can envision the cultural milieu overall. And as you said, it's like a social history. We can actually feel this moment in history and everything begins to start to make sense. I just think the article is fantastic because it shows this context in which radio is almost always a consideration for the work he's doing, whether it's a place to publish artwork for the first time, to release it for the first time, place to review work, place to comment work. It just doesn't go away. So yeah, I think it's a really fantastic article, and I know you agree with that opinion.
I do agree with it. Paul is working on something that has been an idea that has perplexed and fascinated me since I came to work on Flann O'Brien. O'Nualláin writes within a collaborative mode, and that has a bearing on a kind of collaborative aesthetic that is very difficult to tease out when you read him. As you mentioned in your intro, there are these different pseudonyms, these different personas that he erects, these masks, and many people have written about that. These friends, these colleagues that he works with and writes with. We know when Neil Montgomery is making contributions to Cruiskeen Law. We don't have much in his papers, unfortunately, but we know that he wrote some columns for Cruiskeen Law as well. We know that he edited Swim Two Birds. There is this kind of collaborative framework, absent of a sound archive, or absent of some information about these collaborative relationships, but we can resurrect them from textual study. I think what Paul is showing is that it is actually broader and more dynamic and interesting and, sort of free flowing and applicable than we had thought. It's if it's just O'Nualláin writing two of his university friends and they had this chat group about things O'Nualláin was writing throughout his career, that would be one thing. But it seems to be this broader need to work with others to have a product on the airwaves. And I think that's why this study of Morrow is so fascinating, because he brings to bear something on O'Nualláin's style, which I see as very textual, very referential, very, kind of focused in a sort of purely literary context. And so he takes that form of writing, which is meant to be read, and adapts it beautifully for radio. Now, of course, we have the scripts for some of these, and Paul has found them and studied them for this article, but we really can't recapture what the experience of hearing these would have been like. And we can lament that. I think it's fascinating that this idea of adaptation, this idea of collaboration, Nolan was open to it. And we see this again and again in his career. It's fascinating context to look at. One of the things that Paul points at theoretically is a very furtive ground to return to here, which is this idea of Morrow's radiogenic aesthetic, his keen interest in what appearing on radio really is, what it sounds like, what has production value. These are questions within Moore's career that Paul is raising, and they're things that are worthwhile for us to discuss when we consider Nolan's work. How did these considerations come to bear on his own writing? Did they bear fruit? Did they draw kind of new forms of expression? I agree with you. I think that they did, and I think the hope is that this will turn others to this context and this way of thinking, that, radio, you don't get on radio for 10 minutes alone. There are people in that studio, many people involved. It is a collaborative effort, much like doing a podcast, Toby. And I think that's really what we're talking about here. There's a whole network of things happening behind the scenes, and Paul really points to that in an excellent way. So I know we shouldn't pick favorites, but I'm going to say this was my favorite article in the collection. I've told Paul that, so that's not news for him. I just found this so enlightening, so interesting, and I encourage more work like the wonderful essays in this issue for sure.
Yeah, it is a groundbreaking piece of work. It is one star among many. Zan's article and Elliot's article, as you said, each piece is a really distinctive piece of scholarship. All of the pieces accomplish something very difficult from an interdisciplinary standpoint. They're basically like engage fully with radio scholarship, with sound studies, but particularly with this quite illustrious history of radio studies, and that wasn't always easy to navigate at the peer review stage, but it is a very successful collision. I think the final point I want to make about Paul's piece about Chilmoro is that it actually tells us something about how Flann O'Brien came to be Flann O'Brien, and we know like how the transition happened from these early success of his novels, his career in journalism, and how that was a bridge into the re-emergence of his popularity as a writer that happened towards the end of his life. The players in this story are not the ones we expect. Like, for example, his plays, first Faustus Kelly, absolutely play a critical role in that because they were amenable to radio. The work collectively helps to explain why we ended up in the situation we ended up in. So, yeah, absolutely very excited that everyone can now read this stuff. I also want to point out a couple more things before we wrap up. The first of those things is that the edition also features a review of a book which was co-authored by Esther Leslie along with her colleague Sam Dolbear. Esther gave a keynote at the online workshop which originated this entire edition on the 1st of April 2023. The book by Leslie and Dolbear is called Dissonant Waves and Shown an Experimental Sound in the 20th Century. And this was a really nice bit to slot in there, right? Because we're talking about a really important adjacency that helps shed some light, but because it's a review and that can venture a little bit outside of the typical terrain, I'm really pleased to include this story about this guy and Shown, who's just a really fascinating figure.
I agree. I think that this is a feature of the journal which I love, and I think that issues going forward that encourage reviews as wide and diffuse as possible, because these are contexts, certainly the German context, which is relevant to what we've been discussing and relevant to Nolan and his writing about radio, isn't immediately apparent. I love Esther's book, of course, and I think that for those who recall our radio symposium in April of 2023, that is, featured Esther as a keynote and really put forward this idea of the radio listener and these kinds of figures from radio that are not lost, but just maybe not immediately apparent because other forms of broadcast technology have taken hold in our culture. A wonderful cultural study, deeply rich book, and great to have that as a review in the parish as something we can tie to Flann O'Brien.
Absolutely. And the final part to mention to make sure everyone gets due credit for their involvement is the front cover of the issue. How do you get to a good front cover for a scholarly journal? There's not loads of money to pay for the reproduction of certain artworks or commission new artworks. It's harder than people might think to get a good front cover given the conditions we work under. But what we have, courtesy of the permission given to us by the estate, is a design based on a cartoon by Michéal Ó Nualláin, Brian O'Nualláin's much younger brother. It's from the collection of cartoons that Michéal published and in 2009 under the name Kilroy Is Here, because Kilroy was his persona. And your colleague at Flat Singles Press, Ellie Hastings, was instrumental in taking this cartoon and turning it into a meaningful cover. It's actually a really weird image. Like, the more you think about it, maybe if you could do us a favor of kind of just describing the image overall and kind of explaining, because the more you think about it, the stranger it is and also the funnier it is as a cartoon. So yeah, let's just talk about that to finish up.
Sure. I think we're getting into the behind the scenes collaboration and a long list of our most important thank yous, which is thank you to all our contributors, but also to the journal editors, who are Ruben Borg and Maeve Long for their, sort of
And Alana
constant,
Gillespie as well.
yes, and Elena in the wings. But this came about, of just like conversations, over email with Maeve and needing graphic work done quickly. The press, this is something that Flat Singles does all the time. So I reached out to Ellie to see if she would do this. You had reached out to Anne O'Nualláin, the estate of Michéal, to see if we could get permission to use this image. I hope if you have that permission, Toby, that you can put it up as a thumbnail or something associated with this podcast when it goes out, because I agree, it's unique. I chose it because the figure to me just looks like a cartoon version of Brian O'Nolan. These Kilroy cartoons were published before 2009 in newspapers kind of regularly and in pictorial magazines and things like that. So it really is a collection of many of the cartoons and other drawings that Michéal had published. This image, which you only see if you log into the website and you're looking at the issues page. Once you click on the actual journal link, if you go to one of the articles, you're just going to see the thumbnail, which is like a radio sending out a kind of like comic strip wave, lightning bolt. But if you're looking at the issue cover, this is the one that Ellie designed. And it's the partial image from that cartoon of someone who looks like O'Nolan, similarly balding and angry. I don't want to be pejorative here. It is a cartoon of a person, a man with an axe, who's about to axe a radio. If you look at the larger drawing within the context of the Kilroy book, this is a man on a Sunday picnic with his family. It's said that there's going to be no chance of rain on the radio. And of course, it's pouring and ruining the picnic. And so this man, in reaction, has decided to take an axe to the radio. It's definitely intriguing. I think I counted the children at one point and like, were there 12? There were many children in the O'Nolan family. The kind of parallels abound here, but interesting visual, interesting kind of enmity with the radio, this sort of will to destroy radio, this animosity that has built up, this anger towards radio is something that drew me to the image. And I think that, the other thing that fascinates me of these drawings that Michéal did from the 40s and 50s and 60s, and 70s that are commentaries on Irish life of the time, that the radio is often featured, in the room, in the car, out at the picnic, the portable wireless set. The radio is a feature here. More than anything, I think that's what we're returning to and pointing to. The radio is there and present. Why we chose it.
Absolutely. And I think that the cartoon helps to, it's a pastiche of what by that point was a well-established marketing theme. This idea of being able to entertain your family away from home and thus facilitating these trips into the countryside, which begins, with the very first portable gramophones. We say portable, they were still bulky items that you had to heft out to the countryside. In terms of the weirdness and interestingness of this cartoon, the reason why the figure who seems to represent, as you said, Brian, is attacking the radio set with an axe is promising plain clear skies and it's pouring down as if the radio has led them to this place. It's a complex response to an advertising trope. We are told to enjoy nature because we have the requisite smartphone to take a perfect picture. Somehow the agency is reversed. We're dragged out into the rainy countryside in this case by the promise of, oh, it's a picnic, the radio, we can listen to the radio. The cart is leading the horse. And of course, in typical satirical style, because, his cartoons, his commentaries are absolutely hilarious. This trick is being found out and the radio is being punished. But I just think it's really smart. And I'm glad that you picked it out as well and that we did the work necessary to bring it in because it really does bring some character to the edition overall.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Pleasure being here. I think that we, have on our hands a great issue. I know that there's another great issue of the Parish Review coming out, and I encourage everyone to go to the issues page and have a look around. It's certainly been a privilege and an honor to be a special guest editor of the parish, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to do this work. Thank you to the editors and everyone involved in putting out this fabulous issue. It's been an absolute joy.
Thank you, Joe, for being here. Suffice to say that the Parish Review is an open access journal. It is completely free to read, to download, to read in your own time. And there is no subscription fee to pay whatsoever. So if you're listening to the podcast, you have to navigate to Parish Review. That's Paris, as in a church Paris, an ecclesiastical parish, not Paris. parishreview.openlibhums.org. And you will find all the most recent issues, including this one that we've been discussing. Thanks again, Joe. Great to have you on the podcast.